Just can you give me 30 seconds just to introduce you, I think.
Please. Okay.
Hello, participants. Welcome to you all in the international conference jointly organized by CPD and Cornell, 50 Years of Bangladesh, Retrospect and Prospect. Today is day 2, and we are now going to start the panel 4, Towards a Just Society. And the session will be chaired by Professor Geoff Wood, who is Emeritus Professor, International Development, Department of Social and Policy Sciences, University of Bath. So over to you, Professor Geoff.
Thank you very much, Kondika, and also thanks to my dear friends Rahman and Ronak for inviting me and giving me this honor to chair this session. We have 3 very impressive speakers. They will need little introduction, but as they come on to their own presentations, I'll just say another word or 2 about them at that point. So if I may, I would like to just take a few minutes to set up the session with some of my own thoughts about towards a just society, which we might wish to bear in mind as we listen to the presentations. It's clear from the work of this conference, impressive conference so far, that there's some kind of consensus that Bangladesh is at a crossroads point. This is not just the celebration of 50 years of liberation, effectively this very week, and I was only 40 miles away from the border at the time in my village in northeast Bihar. But also because Bangladesh faces the prospect of leaving its LDC status and moving into perhaps a more uncertain world than ever as a result of that, and sets up a huge set of challenges which we've just been hearing about in the previous panel on economic transformation. Now, for me, the notion of a just society embraces a wide conceptual and normative agenda. So I just want to use these brief remarks to share some principles and indicators from my perspective, the lenses in effect through which we need to be looking. And of course, there's an implicit assumption in all of this that the society of Bangladesh has some way to travel, despite its impressive per capita income increases and HDI achievements over the last 3 decades. The challenge clearly is to expand justice for all in the 4 institutional domains of the state, market, community, and household. Immediately then, that tells us that this is not just a matter of governance in relation to the state. It is about the core shared values of the society and how they are upheld in these broad domains. For a just society, these values need to comprise mutual respect and tolerance. The quest for a just society, for me, entails a consolidation of meaningful citizenship, a sense of equal belonging, perhaps captured in the notion of the security of agency for all. And I've written quite a lot over the last few years about the security of agency and unpacking it. For me, trying to cut to the chase, it requires a declientalization in a society like Bangladesh, engineering the shift from dependent to more autonomous security. If you like, from induced Faustian bargains made by the poor in relation to the rich towards greater freedoms and choice. The notion of the security of agency, for me, then requires also a reduction in the high discount rates of poor people, replacing their fear of uncertainty in the future with a stronger faith in their future prospects of well-being, and thus able to plan for and invest in those futures. The experience of uncertainty is an inequality differentiator. It's a contributory definition of poverty and a limit on freedom. The rich, in other words, have much more control over their future destinies than the poor. Now, the security of agency might be achieved through more equality, and we will hear about some of that from Professor Akash. But for me, I'm going to indulge in a little bit of slogan competition. For me, this involves a sharing of the well rather than the present SDG concept of leaving no one behind. For me, leaving no one behind means being relaxed about inequality in a Pareto optimum sense, and therefore relaxed about ongoing unfairness. Sharing the well implies a new political settlement for universal well-being, entailing the greater political challenge of redistributing both opportunities and the enjoyment of security. It requires readjustment of rights and entitlements vertically between classes and horizontally between genders and identities, both ethnic and religious. If not socialism, as in the Bangladesh's 4 original principles, at least social democracy. Now, while the pursuit of equality might be elusive, meaningful citizenship via an improvement security of agency does absolutely rely upon a much stronger application of equity. At present, by contrast, Bangladesh can be considered in welfare regime terms as an informal security regime in which clientelist dependency thrives. Equity relies upon equal access for all in like-for-like pleas for justice and entitlements, enshrined as rights and upheld in law, impartially and free of hidden influences. Thus, equity is a necessary condition for me of a just society and entails a rights-based society rather than a philanthropical one, which since the 1970s has nobly and creatively assisted Bangladesh to its present HGI achievements. It's been the Bangladesh model, development model to date, as it were, a philanthropical society. Rights, however, can only be upheld through the correlative duties by holders of statutory office, subject to free and fair elections. Rights can neither be guaranteed by the franchise voluntarism of NGO service providers who can decide unilaterally who their clients are, nor by commissioned state private service providers answerable to shareholders primarily. But we should not confuse NGO service providers, albeit run as charities with good intent, and civil or political society, since democracy lies upon the 3 interconnected pillars of accountability, participation, and the security of agency. It's not just about elections. It's about what happens between elections. And this requires a robust set of civil society institutions independent of the state, and as an essential feature of a just society comprising meaningful citizenship. Such independence is one of Douglas North's doorstep conditions for an open access society in his seminal treatise, Violence and Social Orders. The principles of equity and rights require this independence for civil society to function as a constant watchdog over the practices of the state and actors in the other domains of market, community, and household. But is that what we are presently witnessing in Bangladesh? Or are these principles being eroded, if ever previously established, with justice and fairness under threat, not just indirectly through a continued reliance upon charitable voluntarism, but more directly through a squeezing of civil society, reinforced by forms of political penetration into the society, acting as a continuation of patron clientelism, albeit in a new, more institutionalized guise. Thus, it seems to me, declientalization as a precondition for a just society looks a long way off. So these are the kinds of discourses I'm looking for in a discussion about a just society. Now, let me come to the presenters, and let me first invite Dr. Binayak Sen. As we know, he is now recently the Director General of BIDS. We expect great things of him in his new role. We also know that he is a forensic analyst of poverty within a political economy context. Forensic, both in the sophistication of his quantitative work, but also in his recognition that quantitative work sets up propositions that also need explanation in other disciplines. So an interdisciplinary Director General of BIDS. Binayak, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Wood. Dr. Mozzam, can I share screen from here? Yes, I can. I can probably. Thank you very much, particularly to Professor Ronak Jahan and Professor Rahman Subhan and CPD for inviting me to give this presentation. This is a paper which I have done with my long-term collaborator, Tonima Ahmed, and she is likely to be joined from Washington. The focus of the paper is basically on two things. It tries to understand the progress in poverty reduction in 2010s, not just by referring to the HIS data set, but referring to a 3-year panel data set of Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey of 5,024 households that is being collected by International Food Policy Research Institute. The advantage of this survey is that it has 3 time points, 2012, 2015, and 2019. So it is ahead of HIS 2016. So in that sense, we can get a more or less complete mapping of the 2010s, at least for rural Bangladesh. The second advantage is that of using BIHS data is that it allows us to not only look at the average progress in poverty reduction in the last decade, but also to demarcate disparate movements in poverty, in and out of poverty. There are 5 categories. Traditionally, there are 4 categories, we know. There's chronic poor, the fallers, the movers, and never poor. Based on the literature on poverty dynamics, we added a 5th category here, which is the occasional slippage into poverty and occasional escape out of poverty, whom we call churners. So first, on the aggregate trends of poverty in Bangladesh. So if you look at the broad trends between 2000 and 2016, it's very clear that whether measured in terms of extreme poverty or overall poverty, Bangladesh has recorded remarkable gains in poverty reduction, both in rural and urban areas. And surprisingly, contrary to the popular notion, the per capita consumption Gini index shows an inverted U-shaped pattern. So you see there is a peak which is attained by 2000, and after that there is a decline in consumption inequality. And we'll come to that we see such trends also in the rural data, even in the rural panel data. I'm not saying that inequality has many faces. Consumption inequality is one of the faces, but this is a very important phase. There are other forms of inequality that are in a society that may experience deterioration, but consumption inequality is showing more or less stable trend since 2005. The gains in poverty reduction is also supported by the childhood undernutrition data, the latest round being 2017-18, and it shows that indisputable decline in stunting measures or in underweight measures. So you can see that. Now coming back to our panel data, what does it additionally show? First of all, at the aggregate level, it shows the same declining trend. In 2012, 34% of rural population was in poverty. It declined to 29% in 2015 and further dropping to 22% in 2019. And all three FGT class of poverty measures support this story. However, if you look at the Gini inequality trends for consumption expenditure, you see a rise, slight rise, but rise nevertheless between 2012 and 2015 from 29% to 30%, and then subsequent quite remarkable decline to 27% between 2015 and 2019. And during this period, the mean real consumption growth rate was 6.9% during 2012-15, and it accelerated further to 7% between 2015 and 19. This is the traditional breakdown, what we knew from the other literature. This is the chronic poor, followed, mover, and never poor. But what we want to discuss here, that when we consider three waves, we can generate a more nuanced story of poverty dynamics. And we define here the churners, those who are occasionally poor and occasionally non-poor during this period, while permanent followers and permanent movers are clearly identified in the data, as well as chronic poor and never poor. And their share is as follows. 50% were never poor during the period of 2010s. 13% moved out of poverty. They were poor in 2012, but by 2019, they moved out of poverty. And even in 2015, they were already out of poverty. 3.6% were followers, permanent followers, which means they were non-poor in 2012, but they fell into poverty by 2015 and continued to be in poverty by 2019. But if you net out the difference, 12 and 3, those 9% net, sort of you can see the poverty reduction in that sense. 10%, this blue, is chronic poor. So they remained in poverty in all three periods. But this is the most interesting statistic, that 24% of the households, rural households, they moved in and out of poverty. They were poor in some years, non-poor in some years, and then again they were poor in some years. In all permutation combination we have given. For instance, we have given all these four subcategories initially discussed. We did also some sensitivity analysis for our poverty line by adjusting by 10% and 20% and coming to the same conclusion. So in conclusion, from the panel data, we see a clear pattern of upward mobility in rural poverty, and that can be seen both by comparing permanent movers as against permanent fallers, and also we can see by comparing recent movers against recent fallers. About the correlates, some of the correlates that came out very strong in our statistical comparisons. For one thing, that the movers tend to be more non-farm oriented. Only category of households which remains to be stuck is relatively stuck in farm sector is permanent fallers. The other categories are evidently moving out of agriculture, and they are not going to pure non-farm. They are going to be a mixed households where household workers are diversifying their occupation. Some are working in agriculture, some are in non-agriculture, and mixed households share has risen very sharply in the 2010s. The other feature is that the household heads education. Permanent mover versus chronic poor comparison shows that the movers were slightly better educated even in the initial period. So in 2012, only 59% of movers had no education, as opposed to 74% for chronic poor.
Dr. Binakshan, you have 4 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. So human capital played a very big part in the story of ascent of the movers, and they were slightly better off in terms of education. Same for the land. So those who own no cultivable lands, even in the initial period of 2012, we find the movers were slightly better off, 59 as opposed to 72. So land access matters in initial condition. And similarly, on the non-land asset, although the 2012 comparison does not show a remarkable difference between permanent movers and chronic poor, so to say, but their enterprising efforts showed up in the subsequent cycles, and that's why they ended up much higher position in terms of non-agricultural asset, 19,000 as opposed to 9,000. Financial assets, remarkably, although we do not much discuss about microcredit importance nowadays, but we found that the microcredit loan has played an important part in the decade of 2010s, and permanent movers more so was aided by microcredit compared to other categories. So that is one. Of course, permanent movers were also taking loan from non-institutional sources much more effectively. There is not much difference in terms of at least one negative shock during the decade. So every category seems to have experienced one shock or another, but the difference lies in the coping strategies. So those who sold or mortgaged land or assets, they seem to be higher in the case of permanent fallers. Like in the initial shock during 2007-12 period, 19% of permanent fallers have experienced this kind of coping strategy of selling land or assets, as opposed to 13% for permanent movers. And we think that the initial starting point played an important role. The last slide, that is the remittance, as we know, played an important role in the resurgence of the rural economy. The movers are, as expected, are better off in terms of access to foreign remittance compared to chronic poor. And this is domestic remittance, however, has increased for almost all categories. So our rural households became more mobile, and so on. So in conclusion, we want to say that the churners, which I did not discuss in this presentation at length, seems to be a more unsuccessful category of movers. They did not quite reach the tipping point that is needed for permanent movement out of poverty, and that requires to be more research. The story of permanent movers confirms the general findings in the literature about importance of multiple routes out of poverty based on human capital and physical asset accumulation, occupational diversification, and outward orientation. There is also a need, we feel, that need to understand better the shock dynamics and poverty dynamics as they interplay, but that is left for further research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Binayak. I think what we're going to do is to move on to Professor Akash and then ask Professor Osmani to take 2 lots of 7 minutes to comment on both papers in sequence. Professor Akash.
Thank you, Professor Wood. I also want to thank, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and especially thanks.
Professor Akash.
Yes.
Dr. Binayak, can you just unshare your presentation, please?
Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Wood, and also thanks to CPD and South Asian Program of Cornell University for giving me the chance to speak in the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh's birth, and also the seminar, and on the topic responding to the challenges of inequality. I am presenting here a brief summary of a larger paper. I present here mainly the theoretical gist of the larger paper here. Some minimum number of tables and figures in support of these arguments are appended at the end of the presentation. If time allows, then we can show them at the end of my presentation. Let me first clear it that I recognize the glorious transformation of Bangladesh from a basket case in 1971, as it was called then, and also one of the least developed countries of the world, described as a test case of development, meaning that whoever can develop Bangladesh from that situation can develop many other least developed countries in Africa and other places. So that was a test case. And now we see it has developed to a level of a developing country of the world, a so-called surprise example in terms of high growth, and a few key indicators of human development. To mention a few, quantitative expansion of education facility for the children. I am not speaking about the quality of the education. Low infant mortality rate, relatively high average life expectation, decreasing incidence of poverty, as Binayak has showed already, and also we know it very clearly. And lastly, we also know there was a quick recovery in the pandemic period. So I recognize all those things, but I also observe that there have occurred very large negative deviations from our liberation war ideals enshrined in the original 1972 constitution of the country. So development is not merely economic growth. It must also uphold the values of the people of the country. In brief, the shortfalls from our original constitutional promises are: 1, we have become a more unequal and a more divided nation. We are divided now economically, communally, and also politically. 2, we are now pretty far away from the four national liberation war ideals: secularism, democracy, nationalism, and socialism in the sense of social justice. Nationalism is also, I am speaking here, in the sense of classical sense, that it is actively against imperialist domination or global asymmetric globalization. Thirdly, the distribution of all our macro achievements mentioned at the beginning, the glorious achievements, are not equal among the different classes of our country, and has become more unequal, becoming more unequal. We are now a more unequal society in terms of income, wealth, social power, and what Jeff Wood has termed security of agency. I have mentioned lastly some typical variables where the inequality is much manifested. That is access to quality education, access to quality health service, access to cheap and adequate finance, access to employment opportunities, and also very fundamental democratic rights. As described in detail in the Constitution, these not only remain unrealized for the majority citizens situated in the lower end of the society, but also they face various structural constraints and discriminations against upward mobility. Even Binayak's paper shows that net upward mobility was for only 9% people. The unequal power structure, that I pointed out as the root cause of this type of situation. The liberation of war of Bangladesh was mainly directed against two kinds of inequalities: regional inequality and class inequality. These inequalities arose through the twin process of resource transfer from eastern zone of Pakistan to the western zone, and monopoly exploitation of a small elite group, epitomized by the super or ultra rich, the 22 monopoly houses of Deepen, Pakistan. The memory still haunts us. And in Bangladesh, various statistics shows that the growth of super rich is highest in the world for Bangladesh. Almost similar pyramidal structure is fast growing in Bangladesh. The system is known as Crony Capitalism. In the last session, this term was used by Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood, where I think cronies flock together and use the state monopoly power to serve each other. Cronies generally constitute a ruling class based on a triangular coalition. A few handpicked powerful members of the business class, bureaucrats, and politicians create a network, and through their recruited clients exercise a monopoly power in all the areas of ongoing development process. Here perhaps I should correct it by saying not all the areas, but the areas which are controlled by the state from top. For example, giving up a contract of a mega project to a particular person, for instance, giving particular favor to a particular export sector, for example, giving particular opportunities in the export processing zone for particular industrialists, etc. In all these things, the cronies play great role, but the cronies are very few and very minority. The structural dynamics of such a nexus of economic, political, and state power perpetuates inequity, that is inequality of opportunity, and also inequality, that is inequality of outcome, in all the fields of, not all the fields, most of the fields controlled by the cronies. Inequity and inequality generated on the basis of an existing unequal power structure perpetuates the existing inequality and reproduces it in an extended manner. So inequality is not just remaining same, it is extended. It is an extended reproduction of inequality. So inequality brings more inequality. This creates the so-called inequality trap for both developing and middle-income countries. This is well known in the literature. The current development process in Bangladesh enables a general, more or less absolute development of all classes, but with very unequal speed, and therefore relative inequality continues to rise, which is now generally recognized to be non-sustainable in the long run. The prediction of Kuznets about self-remission of income inequality through high growth has not been generally realized. So the major challenge before Bangladesh in the crossroad. The major challenge facing today's Bangladesh is to create a more inclusive society by implementing the currently accepted goal number 10 of SDG, which was perhaps most succinctly summarized in the following words. It says, reducing inequality within the country and among the countries. And in the indicator which it offered to measure it was that the bottom people will have a higher rate of growth of their income as compared to that of the top elites. So this kind of reverse, not just average growth rate, but we need to find out what is the distribution of that average growth rate. For example, I remember a popular saying that half of my body is in the refrigerator and half of my body is in the oven, and I am moderately hot and moderately cold. So this kind of fallacy, if we want to avoid, then we must look into the distribution aspect of every outcome and distribution aspect of every opportunity. Now the major thing was for me to how to respond to it, to build a more inclusive society in Bangladesh. There are three different popular strategies known in the literature. One is the Neoliberal Strategy, which the central emphasis is on economic growth and the private agents of that growth. Distribution is left in the hands of the invisible market process. Following Kuznets, it is believed that market in the long run will take care of everything, both absolute poverty and relative poverty or inequality, but we know that this has failed. The second is, at least with respect to inequality, the second strategy is not purely neoliberal. It is a mixture of market-based, private, capitalist-based development with some ameliorating policies like target group-oriented policies, where some credit is targeted to some social security measures are targeted, where some NGOs are allowed to have some reforms. This is this can be have two types of effects. Can be reversed and go for more equality if the ratio of target-oriented policies are implemented properly and largely in favor of the bottom classes. And if the ratio of those targeting and implementation is biased towards elites, then the inequality continues to grow. What strategy is Bangladesh government now following? We can look into the 8th five-year plan book. Here it is suggested that it is following a strategy for pro-poor inclusive growth and equity. This plan has been drawn for July 1920 to June 1925, that is next 5 years. I think it is a policy of the second approach, which will may take it to more equality or can land on less inequality, more inequality, and can land it on more inequality and further inequality. And my belief is the second possibility is larger unless the power structure is changed.
Professor
The
Akash,
strategy.
Professor Akash,
Yes.
you have 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, sorry. The strategy that is suggested for a growth with equity must be an innovative national strategy where political power structure has a firm commitment to reduce inequality and ready to start an equitable process of development through empowering the disadvantaged as far as possible by maintaining also the sustainability of its power during the transition process. Here lies the challenge. Here is the danger. The danger is not of inequality trap, but of too much redistribution or inefficient redistribution, which may cause negative growth or political instability. So in the plan document, 6 best practice examples were mentioned for reversing the inequality trend. One is early childhood development and nutrition interventions. 2 is universal health coverage. 3 is universal access to quality education. 4 is cash transfer to poorer families. I think that can be through credit also. Rural infrastructure, especially roads and electrification. And finally, progressive taxation. The other 5 things can't be done unless the progressive taxation is realized. And progressive taxation cannot be realized unless the ruling class is going to disfavor his cronies. So there is again Bangladesh is caught in a dilemma how to start the equitable growth process without breaking the power structure.
Professor Akash, your time is over.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Akash. And it's my pleasure now to hand over to Professor Osmani, who I imagine is experiencing a big storm in Northern Ireland.
Well, thank you, Professor Wood. And thankfully, I have avoided the storm in Northern Ireland because right now I am in Dhaka.
Ah!
Well, just of course, faced quite a relentless rain after coming to Dhaka, which is not unusual from Northern Ireland experience, so that's okay. So thank you for giving me the floor. And we have just heard 2 excellent presentations from 2 brilliant academics on 2 very important topics, poverty and inequality. Topics which are fundamental to any conception of social justice that Wood says about and anybody can reasonably talk about. Without dealing decisively with the problems of poverty and inequality, one cannot imagine how anywhere a just society can be. Absolutely vital topics, and we are grateful to have excellent papers dealing with these issues. Now, Binayak's paper, true to Jeff Wood's description of Binayak as a forensic analyst, which correctly does a very sophisticated forensic analysis of the disparate movements of different households within the time frame that he has chosen in his panel data from 2012 to and shown the different trajectories that different households taken over this period, and using the categories which are standard in poverty dynamics literature: chronic poor, never poor, transitory poor, and currently. And this analysis is highly informative and instructive, and he has also discussed what are the socio-economic correlates of these different types of transitions. And that can help us a lot to understand why some poor people remain stuck in poverty while some can get out of poverty, and why some stay out of poverty. This information is highly useful and informative, and this kind of analysis must be done. I'll submit that the kind of analysis that is presented in this paper is only the starting point of truly dynamic analysis. If you are interested in poverty dynamics, you need to go beyond that. What this paper does is actually what you might call retrospective dynamics, looking at what happened between a specified period of the 70s 2019. There is the analysis of prospective dynamics. What are likely to happen? Various households of various characteristics. To see what I mean by this distinction between retrospective and which, by the way, we need to do if we want to be true to the theme of this conference, Bangladesh retrospect and perspective. Is it consider this category of chronic poor, defined as those who have remained poor all throughout in all 3 rounds of the panel survey? Yes, retrospectively speaking, they are chronic poor. But are they likely to remain poor in the future? All of them, some of them, which of them? There are actually, you can think of at least 3 subgroups of poor people within the category of chronic poor with very different perspective dynamics. One group, it could be the case that they are moving up slowly, but the progress within this 7 years period has not been strong enough to take them out of poverty. But if the rate of progress continues the way it has, then at some stage in future, they might get out of poverty. Those who are chronic poor today, given sufficient time, other things remaining the same, some of them will get out of poverty. There may be other households who, given the initial conditions and given the progress they're making, will never get out. They're stuck in a poverty trap. There could be yet others who could have joined the first group that has gone out of poverty in future. Unfortunately, they have been stuck by some misfortune, some negative shock, which has brought them down, and they cannot escape poverty. The dynamics and the causations of these 3 subgroups are entirely different. And recent developments of poverty dynamics literature trying to be forward-looking in this way rather than backward-looking in the way the paper has been presented. To get this idea of this forward-looking perspective, the poverty literature uses a phrase these days called the Micawber process. Following Micawber process, actually celebrating from Charles Dickens' novel David Copperfield. This Micawber character got into a debt trap and went into jail eventually, and at the end of life, he ruefully said what he did mistake by taking loans, what he should have done, and he advised everybody, you see, you can get out of poverty if only save a little bit from your income. It might take a long time, but eventually you'll get out of poverty. If you don't take loan, just save a little bit. But the modern analysis of growth dynamics has shown that this Micawber process sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. Given the circumstances that you have, given the amount of savings that you make, and given the productivity of your savings as constrained by your personal endowments, but also the market circumstances and the macro circumstances, sometimes you may be able to get out of poverty. Sometimes you may not. Technically, and this is where I beg to be forgiven by the non-specialist because I'm introducing a technical notion, but I'll try to make it as non-technical as I can. What you need to do is to estimate what in the literature is called laws of motion of income or asset of a household. How do we envisage the income or the asset of the household is likely to evolve over time? This laws of motion idea has been borrowed from the macro literature of growth economics, which refers to the growth of nations, which in turn has been actually borrowed from Newtonian physics. Now, in order to do that, we need to estimate what is technically called a differential equation. The solution of the equation defines what is called the long-run steady-state equilibrium. Now, as this so-called chronic households are progressing over time, what you need to ascertain, what is their steady-state long-run? If that steady state is above the poverty line, then through this Micawber process, they will eventually get out of poverty. But if the steady state is below the poverty line, then which means through this makeover process, they're never going to get out of poverty. What kind of help you want to give to these two groups? Entirely different policy implications. And then there's an interesting case where steady case gives multiple equilibria. There's an equilibrium which is above the poverty line. There's another equilibrium, you are below the poverty line, and somewhere in between, there is a threshold which is called the makeover threshold. If your starting point is above the makeover threshold, you will go to the non-poverty equilibrium. But your starting point is below the makeover threshold, then you will fall back to the poverty. For them, the policy implication is even more different. You need to give them a big push so that they can cross over the makeover threshold. So my point is, in order to do a proper poverty dynamics, which is not just backward looking, which you need to from the beginning, we have to start from the retrospect. From the retrospect, we have to build this laws of motion equation, which will give us a prospective dynamic, forward-looking dynamics, distinguishing between different categories who will eventually go to a steady state equilibrium above poverty line. Those will not go to a steady state above the poverty line. Those who might, if you give them sufficient push and put them over the makeover threshold. And economic analysis as well as policy actions must distinguish between these categories. I hope that Nayak and others who are engaged in poverty dynamics literature will take this next step from retrospective dynamics to future-looking perspective. On Akash's paper, I fully agree with both his analysis and his final conclusions. Only one point where I might take an issue with him is interpretation of actually what he said. Most of us are familiar with this hypothesis that in the early stage of development, it is inevitable that inequality will rise. But beyond a certain stage, when develop, then inequality will begin to fall. This is known as the inverted U hypothesis or the Kuznets approach, which is what Akash was referring to. The question is, if inequality rises initially at the early stage of development, how is it going to fall once you reach a certain stage of development? Akash was suggesting that Kuznets was envisaging self-correcting process of the market. Market will create inequality in the early stage, but market will reduce poverty, inequality in the later stage. I think that is only a partial explanation view of what Kuznets actually said. Kuznets did envisage that market will play a role in bringing inequality down eventually, particularly borrowing from Lewis's model of surplus labor. He was arguing that once the surplus labor gets exhausted, the economy has become sufficiently developed, then wages will rise because there is no longer surplus labor. And if wages of labor begin to rise, earnings differential between the richer and the poorer people will begin to narrow down, and that will contribute to reduction of inequality. To that extent, yes, market process was working. But that was not his main point. His main point was policy-oriented. Once the economy becomes sufficiently developed, governments will take actions to reduce poverty consciously by redistributing income from the rich to poor in the manner of the welfare states that have come into existence in the developed world.
Professor Usmani, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll finish in 2 minutes, hopefully. Now, the mistake, in my view, that was made was not to ignore the policy orientation, the policy importance, but to think that this policy action will only be possible once you become sufficiently rich. Until then, you just accept inequality. That is where I think the mistake was. Our experience around the world today, since Kuznets in modern times, shows that one can take actions, even very early stage of development, which will reduce inequality significantly. We used to cite examples of East Asian economies, and who achieved significant reductions of inequality even in the early stage of development. And some critics have said, well, East Asia is they have unique history and all that. to some extent that is true. But we don't have to look into just Asia. Look at Latin America, the traditionally most unequal part of the developing world. Since 2000, this unequal part of the world has taken a concerted move towards reducing inequality across the subcontinent, and have made significant progress. And recent analysis of how they made this progress have identified two major policy actions by the states. One was broad-based access to quality education. And this was important because as majority of the people acquired good quality education, majority of the people were able to access good quality jobs, employment, which reduced the income differential between the less well-paid and the more well-paid. The second component was a very vast program of conditional cash transfers provided by the government budget to poorer households. Together, they were fundamentally important in reducing inequality across Latin America and across different kinds of regimes. Democratic, authoritarian, I'll just take half a minute. Democratic, authoritarian, fast-growing, slow-growing, dense populations, sparsely populated, all kinds, which means it can be done. You don't have to have unique characteristics to do this possible, but you have to have the will and the political economy framework. And the political economy framework issue is the experience of Latin America shows that while all countries succeeded in bringing inequality down, some countries did more than others. Who did more than others? First of all, democracies did better than others. And within democracies, those who were slightly more left-oriented, not socialist, slightly more left-oriented and right-oriented, they did even better. Given the right political economic framework, it is possible to bring inequality down. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Osmani. Sometimes we're getting a little bits of interference, as if fans are whirring or something. So when people are not participating, if they could be on mute, that would be very good. All right, thank you very much for that. You raised many issues there.
Professor Mustafiz, you please mute your mic, please. Professor Mustafiz.
ভাই আপনার মাইকটা একটু বন্ধ করেন, খুব কথা শোনা যাচ্ছে, কনভারসেশন শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Yes, now it's fine.
Okay, good. Let's proceed then. And it's my pleasure to invite Hussein Rahman to take the floor. Just before I let him do that, of course, we all know that he's the founder, executive director of PPRC, and with that platform has played a significant role in the society.
Professor Oud,
yes.
I think before the Professor Hussein Rahman's presentation, I think the presenters will give a reply to the comments.
Okay, fine, fair enough. Okay, Zilla, we can put you on hold for a little while longer and then come back to you. I have one more comment I want to make when I introduce you. Okay, fine. Let's go to Binayak first then for his responses, and then Akash.
Not really a response, but to register thanks for the comments, and we need to work on the paper along the light of the comment. I would say two things. One is that we have sensed some threshold effects already when I mentioned that the initial condition in 2012, the movers were better than the chronic poor in terms of slightly higher land ownership and slightly better human capital endowment, and slightly also increased value of non-farm assets. So in a sense, it seems that those who have been successful in permanently moving out of poverty compared to the chronic poor, they had accumulated better favorable initial conditions. Now, why they had those conditions and others could not have. That is a question needs further probing, not only from the perspective of the prospective panel work, but also from, I suppose, more qualitative interdisciplinary work. We have to sort of manage the qualitative and quantitative approaches here, because we do not know what are the reasons why historically so this is the case. Second point I want to say about the churners, which I did not reflect well. Churners are not transient poor. Churners are not vulnerable non-poor either. Vulnerable non-poor by definition are those who live just above the poverty line, say in the vicinity of 10-20% above the poverty line. But churners, as the 4 subcategories of churners presented in the slides, which I could not expand, shows there are different categories of churners. Sometimes 2012 they were non-poor, they became poor, and then they again became non-poor. So there is an instability in their movement. Or they were poor, and suddenly they became non-poor. So we are not so sure. That's why we call them recent movers and recent fallers. So we see that this group of fluctuating in and out of poverty constitutes a significant proportion of rural population, 24%, much more than the movers and much more than the permanent fallers, even more than the chronic poor. But there is a silver lining here, that at least the initially Bangladesh, when inherited poverty from the pre-independence days, 80% were chronic poor. They were very, very poor. Compared to that, now we see a lot of upward movement, a lot of trends towards upward mobility. Some are sustainable, like we say permanent movement out of poverty. Some are not so sustainable, and we call them churners. So this churners category exhibit characteristics which are similar to movers, but not they are quite there. So they miss something in their mobility trajectory, and that needs to be also further explored, because we did not do a good job on that. Thank you very much for all the questions.
Thank you, Binayak, and Akash, please.
Thank you. I just want to say that thank Professor Osmani for agreeing with my main thesis. But the main thesis was that policies can ensure growth and equity even at an early stage of economic development. But the question is, for that, 2 things need to be done. One is massive transfer payment. Another is broad-based quality education. That he referred from the Latin American experience. But the second point which he said, that any kind of regime, authoritarian or non-authoritarian, can at least do something in this respect, but better will be the democratic regime. That point is must be seen in the light of Bangladesh. In the Bangladesh, I characterized the regime as a crony capitalism. And I suggested that unless that cronism is broken and a broad-based political regime is there cannot be growth with equality, because cronies are already habituated with a higher rate of return and going away with their capital to outside the country. So in the future, this is the challenge, to replace the cronies with a productive capitalist class, which will see its long-term interest to better to their short-term interest. But whether that kind of capitalist will emerge in future or not, that is the question. Thank you.
I had one question in the chat box asked me, but actually this is a question for all researchers. It is that whether one can estimate wealth inequality currently without doing any new survey on the basis of existing information. So that was the question. I cannot answer right away, but this is a question we have to deal with at some point.
Okay, thank you, Binayak. Let's move on, I was partway through introducing Zalur, although he hardly needs it. And of course, he is now the chair of BRAC. So he's in a very even more prominent position within the society. I have one more memory, which I would be delighted to share, that when Zillow was a PhD student at Manchester University, I came up to give a seminar because Zillow and I have Hamza Alavi in common between us. And we then spent the evening watching on the television Paul Scott's, one of the Paul Scott episode of the history of British colonialism in the subcontinent. And we were all together from many parts of the subcontinent, transfixed, I remember, and it remains strongly in my memory. Zillow, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that, also rejigging my own memory on that. Thanks to CPD and the Cornell South Asia program, both for organizing this, for inviting me, and also thanks to Jeff and the panelists. I will take a slightly, perhaps a different tack on the issue. Jeff, at the beginning, actually put up this issue of the just society and how we move towards that. There's a paper, but I actually will I have just 3 slides, and I'll use up my time, and I'm sharing the screen now, if I may be permitted. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Is that visible? Let me see if I can do it full screen.
I think it'll be good enough as it is.
Okay, all right. So I'm actually not. I'll stick my neck out as an economist, so to say, not really be. If people challenge me, where is the evidence in a forensic manner, I may be stumped to give all the answers. But I am trying to take a, like a 50-year overview of our journey, and then really the retrospect and the prospect type of the formulation of this conference itself. So we'll want to start with taking I'm calling it an alternative take on the Bangladesh story, but it may not be so alternative. Actually, many of you might agree or may also not so agree. All right, 2 things. It's a heroic summary of 50 years of transformation in 2 segments. One is transformational achievements. We have talked of many things, but I want to highlight the systemic, the transformational achievements which are not going to be reversed tomorrow or immediately. First was Bangladesh was defined by its relationship to disasters. Over the 50 years, this is one of the transformational achievement, from a disaster victim to a disaster manager. That is really a fantastic sort of way of understanding how Bangladesh has emerged and is being lauded and recognized around the world. The second is the population management. Again, this is also an achievement not to be underemphasized. In fact, one of my analysis showed that between 1990 and 2010, the per capita income growth could be 1/3 of that growth could be attributed to the fact of the fertility decline. Population management has played a very important role. Third transformational achievement is that many growth stories have been sent off their trajectory by instability on the food security front. Bangladesh actually, after that terrible experience in the early 70s of this famine of 73, 74, Bangladesh has really prioritized food security and succeeded. And this was, we talk of growth drivers, but I think we also need to think of growth cushions which allow the other growth drivers to really play their role and not allow even the state to get destabilized. That is the third transformation achievement I want to highlight. Fourth is the rural-urban connectivity. Bangladesh was identified as, 68,000 gram, isolated villages. In the late 80s, the feeder roads, Kamrul Islam Siddiq, LGED, etc., we have managed to create a national economy, connected national economy. That again, many other countries in their growth stories, they have prioritized, highways more than the feeder roads. Bangladesh feeder roads came before its highways, in many senses, and it played an important role in our resilience and in our transformation, even in our poverty reduction. Third is the integration into global economy. In the 70s, I think you could count on your fingers number of people who had gone abroad or were really part of the global economy landscape. And that is today, of course, that's a completely different reality. RMG obviously has played a great part. Also the remittance, which is the two types, the entrepreneur and the worker, unskilled maybe, but integration into global economy, that again is a transformational achievement. And the sixth is also very critical, is the emergence of women as socio-economic actors of importance. I think this is an achievement which cannot be known. There is lots of problems regarding women's rights now, the violence against women, etc. But the women's agency and their concrete progress in multiple areas inside the home, inside the community, in the nation. Even if you unpack the who are going abroad, these remittance earners, there's a significant who are actually women. Can you imagine that a feature that this relatively less educated women daring to actually venture into foreign lands to pursue their own careers? So this transformational achievements, we need to keep on our belt for the next discussion about prospects. But let's also, I want to have this other slide, which is on, I'll be mindful of the time. What drove the change? And this is my alternative take, if I may be permitted, that I want to highlight 5 drivers of change. And we have, as economists or as sociologists, etc., we have not done enough research or analysis on this. I think the first one is critical. Bangladesh was characterized by a fatalistic mindset in the 60s. 1971 and the independence and the experience of that ushered in what I'm calling a personality revolution. A fatalistic population became an aspirational population. This has really driven multiple types of transformation. So this remains one of our key resources, this personality revolution, despite whatever changes or setbacks they have. The second, that Bangladesh actually has not been very ideological in its way of dealing with society, and ideological in the sense of, big I, meaning, very set frameworks. The second driver I'm highlighting is this grassroots culture of solution-centric innovations. There has been a series of them, not one particular source, series of them, health, education, economy, multiple areas you find. Still now it is continuing. Solar irrigation out of nowhere now is a big thing. And I'm just giving one example, multiple such innovations happening, still happening. Third, we should also give a pat on our own backs, if we may be allowed that, is that the development discourse in Bangladesh has really been reality grounded. I mean, we may have gone off with our own pet theories in one direction for some time, but at the end of the day, if you take a longer term view, I think the development discourse did point out the direction in which to act upon. Poverty was the theme in the 70s and 80s. The fact that there are different types of poor. Extreme poverty was not a word known in 80s, was not in vogue. The development, Binayak and myself, this poverty research we were doing in the BIDS, this differentiation came in, and so many others. The development discourse, that's why remains to my mind, and this particular conference is also very important in that sense, in identifying the potential areas to look at for future changes. Fourth driver is also very important, not just very important, critically important, is the contested politics and the prospect from that of political renewal. This has also been a very important driver of change, because the accountability pressures is not going to come from, prescriptive suggestions from analysts like us. At the end of the day, in all around the world, accountability pressures are generated through contested politics, and that's where it actually matters. But the fifth driver is also important, and it has not really been in focus much. Bangladesh also has been, beyond the political domain per se, has also shown a flair for what I call policy entrepreneurship. In not overall systemic sense, but in sectoral senses. How did the mobile telephony come of age? It's an example of policy entrepreneurship, which really worked well. Multiple other examples, I will not go into much in that. The next slide is, having said that, that's the broad view of the retrospect part. Now, again, a little bit on the retrospect for the prospect part of it, is that we also need to step out of the domain of economics per se, and I think political economy was mentioned. The interface of politics and development has to be understood. And this is where I'm sticking my neck out. I'm suggesting a turning point perspective to understand this politics development interface. And I identify 2 decades for these turning points. One is 1990s, and the other is the 2010s. These are, I think, 2 critical decades for understanding both our strength and also the difficulties we face. 4 turning points in the 1990s. One was, even up to 80s, there was hesitation about market economy. But in the 90s, there was systemic embrace of market economy and competitive capitalism. This was important in ushering in, opening up many things. Second, of course, as I mentioned earlier, contested politics and accountability pressures emerged in that decade, strong policy entrepreneurship, and the flowering of a dynamic social sector, particularly from the NGOs. These characterized the 1990s as a turning point decade. The more recent decade of 2010s, there is growth momentum has continued, but reversals on inclusive development. Some suggest, the statistics, of course, has to be looked at here, but there are, if we look at the overall database, this idea of reversal on inclusive development, multiple indicators are also coming here. But again, as I'm saying, I'm sticking my neck out to really project some hypothesis.
Dr. Jubilee Rahman, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Reversal on competitive capitalism and meritocracy. This is Crony Capitalism was mentioned earlier, but the meritocracy reversal is also important to keep in mind. Access gains have happened in the social sector. They are failing to translate into quality gains. And the political process in the 2010s has been marked by triple marginalization. Marginalization of the political opposition, marginalization of sectoral constituencies, and marginalization of grassroots constituencies. So I'm now, the governance as we stand, I'm calling the new normal of political governance as defined by 4 defining features. One is the systematic weakening of downward political accountability. Second is the purposeful encroachment on social space, particularly regulatory intrusion into the social sector has increased, extreme intolerance of non-sanctioned political or even protest activities, and the qualitative escalation of corruption. That is the new normal. What is the consequences of this new normal? 5 consequences which you need to keep in mind for the prospects for just society. One is that there is a extraordinary official complacency on development performance and disregard of reform priorities. There is an elitist overfocus on growth at the expense of quality of life. And despite this enormous sense of stability, in the sense of no political opposition, reality of business uncertainty despite stability impacting on investment and stagnation, there is a sense of youth desperation and a brain gain which is replaced by brain drain. And there is a simultaneous crisis of incentive distortion in the market and the state. Three challenges on way forward. One is the reframing of the middle income discourse. We need to do that. That's a elitist growth, narrowly growth-centric framing of the middle income discourse.
Dr. Rahman, your time is over.
Okay. So the next two is the new drivers and the new initiative windows. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Zillur Rahman, could you please unshare your presentation?
And if I can now turn to Dr. Ifka Ruzaman, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International, Bangladesh. So well qualified, both from his work in Bangladesh and outside Bangladesh as well, well qualified to pick up some of the themes that Zilla's just been enunciating, and perhaps also picking up on Akash's earlier remarks about crony capitalism. Dr. Ifka Ruzaman, I can't see you. Are you with us?
I'm with you. Sorry, but I can't. Okay, just a second. Okay.
There we are. Great. Excellent.
Thank you, Chair. Fellow panelists, let me begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to Professor Rahman Subal, Professor Ronak Jahan, and colleagues in CPD for giving me this opportunity and privilege to take part in this important event. I commend Dr. Hussein Rahman's excellent presentation of a very well-researched paper, very precise and sharp arguments, and extremely thought-provoking set of issues that he has flagged. I, for example, agree about the importance of the timeliness of the two key questions that he has raised in the paper, namely, will our middle-income aspiration be achieved in a manner to be inclusive and will benefit the common people? And of course, whether democratizing the middle-income dream becomes a new challenge for Bangladesh as we move on. I may add that the middle-income aspirations will most likely remain grossly unfulfilled if these questions are not properly addressed in earnest. Zillur rightly identifies 6 transformational achievements he has presented of Bangladesh and 5 drivers of change, and I agree with him. By amplifying Hussein Zillur's analysis of the linkages of politics and governance, I would like to briefly highlight my understanding of the primacy of politics and governance, which to me is the crux of the journey to the achievement of the middle-income aspirations. As I see it, the aspirations of parallel with the aspirations of middle-income achievement, aspiration of monopolization of the political space is the most important predicament against democratic and accountable governance, manifested in deepening politicization of key institutions of democracy and national integrity system, which have caused low level of rule of law and enforcement of policies and systems. It needs to emphasize that the state has been awakened by a near absence of political cohesion. Confrontational politics of the two major political parties have severely damaged the space for democratic space for mutual accommodation and a healthy political competition. They have embraced a political behavior which is all about challenging the legitimacy and acceptability of each other. The political enterprise is about achieving a monopoly of legitimacy to win power, or in other words, a zero-sum game. The other important feature of political culture is that that has evolved over the years is the intrinsic linkage of politics with business. Politics is about investment. People invest money and muscle to rise to positions of politics and power in the party or in the government. And the election is taken as a winner takes all game, which is nothing short of, in which nothing short of victory is acceptable. Losing the election means that you lose everything, whereas winning it is taken as a license to abuse power for personal gain at all levels. A crucial area of democratic deficit in Bangladesh is the weakening of the key institutions of democracy. The ineffectiveness of the parliament is at the core of the deficit in institutional structure. Parliament's delivery as a forum for debate on matters of public interest, as a lawmaking body, and as an institution to ensure accountability of the government to the people through proper functioning of the committees and other parliamentary role remains far from the expected level. Not only the parliament, but also other key institutions of democracy and the national integrity system like the judiciary, the election commission, administration, law enforcement agencies, public service commission, human rights commission, and anti-corruption commission have been significantly politicized and their effectiveness compromised, resulting in governance deficits and corruption and a culture of impunity. Thanks to this institutional dysfunctionality, the state structure has been exposed to kleptocratic capture by those who benefit from the abuse of power and corruption at the expense of those who would like to see that these are controlled. The other factors of governance deficit and corruption are weak oversight functions, conflict of interest, nepotism, collusive non-compliance, and the deficit of accountability of lawbreakers who often enjoy impunity. In this context, what is important to note also is that any criticism of the government, even exercise of the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of expression and dissenting views is branded as aligned to the enemy camp and conspiracy against the regime. The scope of people's engagement for voice and accountability and participation of the civil society and media have been grossly curtailed by laws and their some laws and their motivated use. If you look forward,
you have 2 minutes.
I'll finish in 2 minutes. Reaching higher standards of governance in this context demands a retransformation, in my view, of values, norms, and practices in political space and political parties and their affiliated bodies. This essentially involves delinking political positions and direct or indirect beneficial affiliations from business and profit-making opportunities, which I thought was the key problem in the governance challenges of Bangladesh. The sooner our politicians realize how badly politics is annihilating itself from the people, the better for the bridging of the governance deficit that we have all heard. Political leaders need to recognize that it is basically in their hands to transform their parties into genuine political institutions. Equally important is the task of depoliticizing the other democratic institutions that I mentioned. Finally, an important component in the governance structure is the participation of the people, as I indicated, to raise voice for accountability. Space must be enhanced, not curtailed, for civil society and media to exercise their rights and responsibilities as enshrined in the Constitution, without which any prospect of holding the power to account will remain only a dream. Democratization of the middle-income aspirations will remain grossly unfulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ifka. I would have expected nothing less from you than what we've just heard. I think you've also dealt with some of the comments that were coming up on the chat about moving back into a more political economy discussion in relation to power and how it's exercised, and away from some of the technique issues that have been also in the discussion. I think we've reached that point now where
Professor Wood, at this moment, Dr. Jillur may respond the comments of the.
I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. I guess it's 1 or 2 minutes, right? So I'll just take that. First of all, there is also a paper, actually. I just summarized it rather heroically for this time frame. So there's a paper where something else is more elaboration there. And Iftikhar's, I think basically there's he has elaborated a bit more and in a way agreed with some of the comments that I made. There was a comment in the chat box about how the reversal of meritocracy is happening. That's, I think Iftikhar has really also touched on that the incentive in terms of, if you look at bureaucratic appointments, the public bodies which recruit people, the politicization of those really have seen an important reversal of democracy, meritocracy, and that's, I think, equally important problem when you look at moving ahead. I think I just would, one point I couldn't bring in much, and I think that's a debate I can engage with Iftikhar also later on, is that the governance discourse itself, I think we need a additional discourse, engagement on that. Because the good governance discourse has been innocent of how to factor in the political variable. And I think the key challenge, if you have to move forward, is how do you integrate the political variable in our analysis of governance? We cannot just leave it to the idea that, they should do this, they must do this, etc., etc. So there, I think a more analysis of, for example, one, I had a point about who are the potential new drivers. There is a new young middle class struggling to emerge, some of whom are actually on the streets now campaigning for the road safety. On a real life problem for them, these are poorer students where a little increase in the transport fare means a lot to them. And they have come up with a way to challenge that politically. We need to really get a better understanding of where the political energy within society is being born, is accumulating, and how does the discourse can connect with that. I think that's the challenge for the future and for a future discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Kondekar, I imagine now you've had time to collect up some of the questions that have been posed. So I'll hand over to you to do that. We might not want to take all of them, but I'll let you do the selection and we'll pose those to the presenters.
Okay, Professor Ruth, thank you. I think there are a good number of questions raised by the attendees, I think, to different presenters as well as to the discussants. To Dr. Binayak Sen, already mentioned that, can you suggest a methodology for estimating wealth inequality in Bangladesh without conducting any new survey and using currently available data? To Professor Akash, Professor K.S. Murshid mentioned, if consumption equality is low or stable, why does income inequality matter? Mr. AMSA Amin mentioned, a just society cannot be built in Bangladesh when crime, corruption, chronism are endemic in politics. Only way a just society can be built in by strongly inducing human, social, moral values in politics, thereby fundamentally transforming existing political culture. Kate Tanha mentioned that already attempted during the caretaker government these kinds of practices in Bangladesh. Our morals will change in the environment around us as changes. Shamadas Banerjee mentioned that markets do not reduce inequality or create a just society. One sees that in a high-income free market economies such as USA. There is a high level of insecurity, feeling of injustice, discrimination, anger among the Black and the poor white community there. Habibul Khandokar mentioned that personality revolution or changes in values could matter to reduce maybe some issues like crony capitalism or other issues. Then Samjas Banerjee mentioned that the participation of women is a key factor in creating greater social equality and social justice. Then another person mentioned that how can a just society be established in a labor-abundant economy like Bangladesh, where workers cannot be revolutionarized because they have only one job and are only one step away from poverty. Jahidur Rahman mentioned what is a possible theoretical process to break down chronism. reclaiming democracy or external non-political or foreign interference. Kate Tanha mentioned, would you kindly summarize your arguments on why democracy is necessary for development? To Esar Osmani, Mizan Rahman mentioned, we need to know your take on a just society in our context. Habibul Khandekar mentioned Kuznets's view was based on industrial revolution experience, and he did put it as a hypothesis, not as a theory. Will you identify the name of Latin American countries? Then he mentioned Costa Rica probably has the best public health and healthcare services. Then Chris Rahman mentioned that apologies if the question is too broad, but who do the panelists view as the potential drivers of the necessary changes outlined in their presentation? It seems unlikely that political and economic elites will modify their behavior on their own. And the marginalization of trade unions and other elements of civil society has helped to limit the accountability of the state and individual political actors. There are some questions to Dr. Hussein Rahman. The first question is that, do you feel that female secondary education stipend that has been initiated in early 90s played a positive role in the empowerment of women in Bangladesh? Should it still be continued and encouraged today, given the high rate of child marriage? Max Tilly mentioned, I would be very interested also on your thoughts on the middle income discourse. Hope you have time to elaborate a bit. Not sure whom he refers to. Kate Tanhamens, can you please comment more on the reversal of meritocracy? I think that has already touched upon. Another anonymous attendee mentioned, Dr. Zillur Rahman, are you suggesting that Bangladesh has moved out of vicious cycle of poverty and into the vicious cycle of poor governance? So these are the questions to the panelists.
Thank you very much. That's quite an array of questions. Can I, in inviting the three presenters to make a selection, can I suggest that they select those questions that really bring us back to the core theme of the session, A Just Society? Binayak, do you want to go first?
I don't have much question to answer, but only to comment that if only Bangladesh could sustain the kind of growth rate it has achieved and kind of poverty reduction it has seen in the decade of 2010s, it will be on the verge of attaining a number of SDGs, including SDG number 1. So while all the sort of emphasis should be put on achieving Rawls's 2 principles, the equal liberties, the first principle, that's fine, and the way should be found out for that. But the second principle, that the poorest, the maximum principle, should not be forgotten. And as long as we can protect the poorest, and as long as we can remove the ugly faces of poverty from Bangladesh, that would be a no mean achievement, so to say. While we know that there are many reasons why the countries suffer from middle income traps, and we may be landing into one of those traps of our own making as well. But that is a very complex and difficult question of social transformation, and not all societies have found out answer to those questions in a limited time horizon. It may take about 20-30 years to resolve all the problems of governance, liberty, and democracy. My hypothesis is that the middle class share was only 10% in 91-92. It is now about 30% pre-COVID. So if it reaches 60% in another 20 years' time, the demand for quality of governance will change. The pressure would be enormous on the polity, and the quality of leadership will be different. So while I am not deterministic on economic grounds, I'm still pointing out there is a correlation between economic gains and political gains. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Akash?
I think consumption inequality is everywhere lower than wealth or capital inequality or income inequality, because the Engels law works in favor of more propensity to consume and declining propensity to consume as income increases. So the inequality reduces naturally. But still, inequality of income matters, inequality of wealth matters, inequality of education matters, inequality of everything matters, because it creates an imbalanced power structure and confines your rights and opportunities to a very narrow box. And that is not justice. That is not justice. And market and secondly, market cannot ensure equality by itself, and justice also cannot by itself, unless the power structure is favorable for the poor. So that is recognized everywhere. After Piketty's analysis, it is recognized for even developed country, middle income country, low income country. Everywhere the share of capital is increasing at a larger rate in the value added than the share of labor. Even when the labor's productivity increases, real wage does not increase in that same rate, and the part of the value added goes to the capitalist. Perhaps my table 4 shows it clearly for the case of Bangladesh. Never during the 40 years, the real wage rate kept pace with the real productivity rate gain for them, and this is injustice. Because what I have increased my productivity, but I haven't got it the due share for me.
Okay, can I stop you there?
I can stop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Zillow, please.
Thank you. I think there was a reason why Bangladesh became independent. I mean, from the pre-independence time, this poverty alleviation, etc., those were also happening in incremental sense. Bangladesh became independent not just for poverty reduction. It had a different and larger dream, actually. That foundational dream is about just society, definitely, prosperous society, and the height of whole issue of dignity. That's why we find that people, even when there is some indicators of development around, but if they feel huge deficits in those other areas, the discontent is quite high. And I think it's important also to, at the same time, as I said, we need to be here also empirical in terms of really understanding where we have progressed, how we can further progress. And I think also important that in that sense, the aspiration of the people, we need to really hear them. The students on the streets of Dhaka today or other places, there's a crisis that the process, not just of the political leadership, discourses are also not listening sufficiently to the people's aspiration. They are not, what are they really aspiring for? What are they talking about? So I think there we really need to, the discourse itself, the discourse efforts also need to connect there. Certainly women's secondary stipend was mentioned. It did play a very important role. I think one of the big low-hanging fruit which can be dealt with right tomorrow is to make secondary education compulsory and make this secondary stipend for girls universal. That itself would have so there are, Bangladesh, I think in that sense and I think the state market interface is a critical issue we need to look at. I personally feel that we haven't looked sufficiently enough. We have looked at economic development. I think the political development alongside economic development, both self and as an enabler of economic development, those are issues that we need to look at. And hopefully in the future, we will be looking at that more. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder, I know that we're more or less out of time, but I wonder if I may be permitted a few minutes to make some summing up points.
Actually, Jeff, if I may guide you, have your say. And if it goes over the time limit, so be it. I mean, don't get carried away, but still free to go on.
Oh, that's very kind of you indeed. Well, what I really like to do is just to pick up some of the ways in which the presenters and the discussion has prompted me to make a few points. They probably be a little bit incoherent, but I'll do my best. I think I probably want to start by saying that I think as social scientists, we expect too much from the way in which a society develops or progresses. We seem to expect it to behave through rational relationships guided by morality and values. But the real world is far more chaotic than that. And I think one of our challenges as social scientists is to try and understand that chaos a little better and perhaps roots out of it. And in that respect, I said in my opening remarks that it seemed to me that we're looking at the opening up, the expansion of justice in all these four domains of state, market, community, and household. And if we take these four domains, they're very parsimonious for the sake of clarity and to make a point. It seems to me that we can distinguish societies between the degree of permeability or impermeability between them. And one of the problems, if we are expecting these broad domains, and we can always add more and play around with this, if we're expecting each of them to find ways of compensating for the weakness of those other domains and the practices and behaviors in those other domains, then of course they require a degree of independence from each other. They require a degree of impermeability between these domains in order to act as independent compensating forces upon the weaknesses of the other three domains. So for me, that's become a kind of working theoretical principle through which I try to understand both the differences between societies and the problems that they have. If you look at the UK at the moment, we're seeing an increasing permeability, again, of those domains. We might have been through a period of their relative independence or their relative autonomy from each other, but we're seeing those now collapsing and having, therefore, negative effects upon the society as a whole. I think the second point I want to make, is to pick up the point about the good governance discourse briefly. And I have a lot in common with Zilog here, and I'm grateful that he's focusing our attention upon the issue of what is rather than, in a sense, what ought to be. And this connects to this paradox discourse that's been around about Bangladesh for the last few years. I'm very hostile to this notion of paradox. I think there are different reasons to be hostile, but I will mention just one, which is that most societies don't develop with good governance. They might achieve some improved governance as they make progress, particularly picking up Vinayak's point just now, that if you have some kind of expansion of the middle in Bangladesh, an educated middle, a middle that wants more voice and accountability, then yes, you may get moves towards improved and better governance. But it seems to me that most societies have developed on some of their indicators, depends how you want to define development, they've developed on some of their indicators through appalling governance. And look at the US, look at the UK, read Dickens, read Trollope especially, for appalling governance during a century of major development on a whole lot of indicators in the UK. I think Zilla also is right to make a point, which I pick up from his paper rather than from the discussion today, about non-linearity of the way in which societies evolve. They can go into reverse. This is part of the, as it were, chaos, rather than seeing a step-by-step, morally better transition. And again, I think you see this from Douglas North's work, particularly in Violence and Social Orders, the way in which societies can move around in different directions and go into reverse as well. The Harvard historian Jill Lepore has recently published a book, Is Society Coming Apart?, with some fairly dire predictions of what could be happening in the USA. But of course, from my own perspective in the UK, we're fearful of that as well. And France has some difficult elections coming up early next year. So let's be aware of the fact that societies don't make steady progression by the kinds of just society values that we support. Now, let me come on. I'm not doing it in quite the order. Let me come on to Binayak's paper. I think you all know that I admire Binayak's work tremendously and have learned a lot from it. But let me try and draw a stronger link than perhaps we've had during the evening, afternoon, morning, wherever we are, between his paper and the themes of the session, just society. When you start getting these different trajectories across these 5 categories that Binayak is talking about, and then you start to wonder what's the meaning, what's the policy significance of disaggregating poverty and the understanding of it into these 5 trajectories. And people could play around with it's 5 or less or more, whatever. Well, it's that depending who you are, what your trajectory is, and the fact that it might go in reverse later periods of your life, come back to that, then you face different kinds of institutional barriers between enjoying, as it were, the benefits of overall economic growth and your own livelihoods. Different kinds of poverty tell us that people have different kinds of institutional challenges to face in order to realize improved and resilient livelihoods. And again, I come back to that 4-domain analysis of state, market, community or society and household, that people at different positions, both in the class and the society horizontally, and at different points in their life cycle, are experiencing different institutional barriers between economic growth and their own livelihoods. And it seems to me that becomes the next step in the analysis and connects lots of what's been said in this session, drawing that together. And I will just use the occasion of making that point. There has been some very interesting types of progress. Now, Rahman Saban and I have one thing in common, which nobody else may have amongst us, which is that we have both read Eric Janssen's revisit to his village near Maniganj, by Mara. I know Rahman has read it because he wrote the foreword to it. And I've read it as well. Now, when Erik Janssen was in that village some 30 years ago or whatever, he was looking at some households, he and his wife then, Bodilmal, still his wife, they were looking at families actually that they're expected to die very soon after their departure from that village. They just did not see how the hell these families could possibly survive beyond the next year or two. Such was their destitution. Now, Erik Janssen went back to Weimar and he reconnected with those families. And it tells a very emotional story about progress, because some of those families have by and large survived. And in fact, some of them survived very well and made all kinds of progress. And this is where we really have to get back to, and it has been touched upon by all of you, which is the relationship between individual agency. You heard me talk earlier about security of agency, the relationship between individual agency and, if you like, these institutional domains and how people can engage with them and prosper within them and avoid the traps and the barriers and the hurdles. I wrote a paper 2 or 3 years back about protecting the gains, because with all of these programs that we see, I've been involved in some of them about supporting the poor, you know, you reach a kind of threshold and you think, okay, they're okay now, they can move on, they can make progress. Some of them do, like in Weimar, they have to overcome an awful lot. Some of them don't, because they hit the barriers of the real political economy that Iftikhar was talking about. So there is optimism, there is individual agency, and I've always said that if I was on a desert island with myself and somebody from Bangladesh, I know who would survive, and it wouldn't be me. That agency is there, and that's, I guess, why I've been glad to spend so many years associated with Bangladesh. Now, let me come finally to Akash, and I want to connect this a little bit to the previous session on economic transformation as well. So I'll come back and be a little less emotional and a bit more specific, because clearly Akash is raising, you know, many issues around the core strategic options within this context of inequality, high inequality compared to other lower middle income countries, it should be said. Now, we've mentioned that Bangladesh, 50 years on, looking forward, so this is the prospect bit, looking forward is at some kind of significant crossroads with, as it were, almost, you could say, a victim of its own success. That as it moves out of LDC status, so it loses a whole lot of things by way of supports in the global economy and faces lots of uncertainty going forward. But what it does do is generate an imperative for the structural economic transformation away from a lower skilled labor intensive model, which has taken Bangladesh to this point. And it seems to me that the challenge is this process of the transition in that economic, or that imperative of an economic transformation. How can the society be managed through this transition without serious internal divisions and political volatility? It seems to me that there's a particular clock ticking at the moment, and that is the sense in which, because of the success of Bangladesh so far, it has generated expectations, generated aspirations. Nothing wrong with that, But the challenge, it seems, the clock is ticking with aspirations outstripping the generation of opportunities. And I think somebody mentioned in an earlier session, or maybe it was the BIDS conference last week, that if we have quality education, increasingly confined to a new elite, this new bourgeoisie of Bangladesh, this expanding middle class, as I think Rahman mentioned yesterday, this elite and this new, slightly expanding elite, they can reproduce their superior class position much more effectively than anybody else and seize those opportunities and confine those opportunities to themselves. And it seems to me that what Bangladesh is facing, I'm almost at the end of my peroration, encounters now political dangers associated with relative deprivation. And relative deprivation, we have to understand as a cognitive phenomena, how people perceive and feel, and not just as an objectively observed phenomena. How will the newly frustrated and the newly excluded from these expanding opportunities, how will they react? The 2 million new entrants to the labor force every year and so on. Can the society of Bangladesh absorb these frustrated ambitions and aspirations quickly enough in the transition process to offset severe political instability? That seems to me to be the nub of the challenge faced over the next few years or decade. Now, of course, we know that in China, facing that transition, facing that economic transformation, uses, of course, the authoritarianism of the Communist Party, a membership of 10 million loyal apparatchiks, engaging internally in punitive, repressive, limited access politics, requiring its people to indefinitely postpone their political and social freedoms for the sake of a collective economic growth at any cost to everything else. Now, is this how it's going to be for Bangladesh? Clearly, we are seeing a centralization of power. We are seeing a political penetration. We are seeing a loss of independence of other self-correcting, compensating institutions in the squeezing of civil society. Is there another way than China to be more inclusive during this transition, to manage this transition to structural transformation? Well, it is about political settlements. And here perhaps we can actually learn something from richer societies, my final point. Because clearly what we're looking for is a constructive partnership between state and all interest in the society. And that does require a certain self-awareness on the part of elites, leaderships, and so on. Now, what might be the drivers of that self-awareness? Not just a moral imperative, but yes, of course, we'd like to see that within the political culture of Bangladesh, but actually also self-interest. If you look at historically at the formation of new post-tipping point political settlements in Scandinavia, across Western Europe, in the US, and so on, you're actually looking at elites and middle classes making concessions on the basis of to others, on the basis of self-interest. They begin to understand that as aspirations outstrip opportunities, that if they don't do something about that, then actually their own privileges, their own rent-seeking, maybe their own corruption, their own crony capitalism, all of those things, the way in which they make their own privileged wealth, they are all under threat unless through that perception of their own self-interest, they develop the self-awareness to make concessions to other classes in a more inclusive social policy. That's the end for me. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Wood, and thank you, everyone. With this, we like to conclude the session, panel 4 discussion. And thank you all the panelists and presenters and the discussants who joined this long and very learning and illuminating discussion. So we would like to welcome you all to tomorrow on session 5, panel 5 and panel 6 discussion. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Okay.